All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. This is Left Bank Books Presents Online, award-winning poets Ted Mathis and Aditi Machado, who will discuss their new books of poetry, Gold Cure by Mathis and Emporium by Machado. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore, celebrating 51 years this year. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Ted and Aditi, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We have adapted to the current situation and are bringing you the things that you love the most about Left Bank Books, including curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world even. So Aditi, your family can order copies from us if they would like. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Ted and Aditi and Left Bank Books by purchasing a signed copy for you or for all of your friends at left-bank.com, or we'll have to double check, but I think we can get signed copies. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff here through the most unusual of times. So thank you so much for your support. Your support is what helps keep this event series going as well. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We have done almost 100 virtual events at this point. Tonight we will hear each poet's work and a discussion followed by audience Q&A. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event, so you can type your questions as a comment and we will get to those. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. Lustrous, tender, and expansive, Gold Cure moves from boomtown gold mines and the mythical city of El Dorado to the fracking wells of the American interior, excavating buried histories, legacies of conquest, and the pursuit of shimmering ideals. Ted Mathis skewers police brutality on the ribs of a nursery rhyme and drives Petrarchan sonnets into shale fields deep under the prairies. In crystalline language rich with allegory and wordplay, Mathis has crafted a moving elegy for the Anthropocene. In Emporium, Aditi Machado investigates transnationalism and translation in poems that follow a merchant woman as she travels a 21st century Silk Route. As on the original Silk Route, this merchant is engaged in economic transactions, but also cultural exchanges, unmonetizable reciprocities, the sensory excesses of the marketplace, coins moving from hand to hand, the smell of food and sweat infusing the air, the noise of translation and multilingualism. Is this tradeswoman in control of her destiny, business, or is she a commodity of impenetrable global forces? Her investigative, digressive travel seems a way to interrogate history and money and her own entanglement in such irresistible threads. Ted Mathis is the author of Gold Cure from Coffeehouse Press, as well as Null Set, The Spoils, and Forge. His honors include fellowships and awards from the National Endowment for the Arts, New York Foundation for the Arts, Poetry Society of America, and St. Louis Regional Arts Commission. His poetry and criticism have appeared in American Poetry Review, Bomb, Boston Review, Conjunctions, the Georgia Review, PBS NewsHour, and elsewhere. He holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and lives in St. Louis, where he teaches at St. Louis University and curates the 100 Boots Poetry Series at Pulitzer Arts Foundation. Aditi Machado is a poet, translator, and essayist. Her books include the poetry collections Emporium, winner of the 2019 James Laughlin Award, which came out from Night Boat Press this year, and Some Beheadings, winner of the 2018 Believer Poetry Award. She is also the author of several chapbooks as well as poetry and prose texts, appearing in journals like Lana Turner, Volt, the Chicago Review, Western Humanities Review, and Jacket 2. A former poetry editor for Asymptote, Machado currently works as the visiting poet in residence at Washington University in St. Louis. We are happy that she is here. And now I would love to welcome Ted Mathis and Aditi Machado for Left Bank Books. If everyone at home could please give them a round of applause. Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, Aditi.
Hi, Ted. Hi, Shane.
So we do have a very wonderful audience this evening, and we are going to go ahead and get started. So,
Great. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, Shane, for that introduction. I'm very sorry that I forgot to update my bio for you. I'm now teaching at University of Cincinnati. I have a longer list of thank yous for later, but for right now, I want to thank my parents, Francis and Margaret Machado, and my brother and sister-in-law, Sid and Saman, who have woken up at an ungodly hour to attend this reading. So welcome to Poetryland. The poems in my book are very long and quite interrelated. So I'm going to read pieces from across poems and sections without stopping to read titles or anything like that. Herewith the narrative. Nope, not a narrative. Herewith the disquisition. Nope. Herewith the gospel, the encomium, the diagnostic manual, the morality play, the political tract, the something completely pointless by one tradeswoman, published in the year of our overlords, 2020. I came along a silk route. I came low like low things. Slow, farcical leaves rimmed the trees. Some chic birds. I came along a long way, bolstered by merchants and prophylactics, and an obscure shade that became my practice. Sometimes I'd stop to confer with magnolias and find the writing on the margin creeping in. Or I'd look up at the archive, wandering hysterically like a wound. I'd stop at markets where rank matadors offered me coins. I'd stop at theaters and watch the facsimile faces trotting by, the customary graffito on a restaurant tile. I'd forget my resistances, small wrists, and gussy up my deadlocked tongue. Nothing to see here, I'd say, but virtuoso shrubs. Along the silk route upon which I came the very neat devices of a memoirist or politico. The silkiness of the route was of an old time, colored like old colored photographs, with seepages into the corners of sight. Silk either wore me down or bore me out of a series of vacancies in which I scanned beaches. I was caught. Who caught me? But a phantom certainty, certainty like a quality of gems and cautious doctrines. This was my distraction, and having to tighten my belt and all that, and yet I was arriving, words appearing on points of fact. Prickly or vine-like, I proposed this and that. I was told nation or rhapsody or wear simple clothes. I heard those statements as limpid feuds, traumas wandering out of musical bars. I had no purchase on those points. First, I agree to look upon the city. There is a rhythm, properly incensed. A church rings clear through my doubts. I decline all things in respect to how I see them. The dative reigns. I like that pile up like ornaments of queens. Then I look again at the heap. Then I struggle to see how each body is separate. No precision that isn't imprecision. First, I agree to touch that tree line, measure that awesomely obtuse leafiness the way Psalms build height into it. First, it measures me across a distance, a tree line internal to somnolence beyond which could not grow any more obtuse my reason for being. Then there's a shift in the tree line. Then I look again upon the city. Somebody's body is unlucky in that precise manner by which is meant plainness. Somebody else's thinking is in gutters or nervous systems. What's the matter, I ask, as in, what's a matter? Up ahead, the emporium, up ahead. The chief comparison is to a quality of light. The people have not poured in as light, won't pour out. The poets stall, vending short texts and long texts. Scarves run through bodily fluids. We live in the clusterfuck. The chief definitions are here now. The chief epics are of markets spinning, carnival eyes. Pastimes replete with blinds. The chief binaries fold and unfold. The garden and the kitchen is in the street. Sweet herbs and cow patties. Sweetness, the provocation and chief style of the poets. The extent to which history inscribes industrial products is perfume, one writes, cupping silver. Petals, petroleum, idioms profuse and tangled in the neck, a goblet. History paves the emporium, and porous the gemlight. And says the purveyor, best not study such shapes, but silk, to me, of silks, of the brushing of blouses against silken nipples, of between her legs the stolen red. And even money isn't quite like money when silk buys me, or have I it, or has it blended in the fabrics of when there was a room for me to try on that there was weather then, and now too, it's silking my mind. And the qualities as they continue are the silk under the hand, reads the libel. Silk, that's the dual error and shock of new precision, and involuntary, not involuntary exactly, but desired frisson. I've pulled the brocade off the rack. Sudden queries, sudden as vendors. Do they sell fruit, sell textile? I've been so exact, I've cut corners. Oh, obsolescence, oh, light bring, sifting the accidental tree. I desire cinema in a sense, all factories sense the dilemma. Ought I shove off? Fold this. A relation blooms in this landscape full of abuses. Fold this. Come. You. Come over here. Sit with me. Let's exercise our vocal cords. Let's draw them out, limbs. Let's say there's always a longer or shorter tress, always congruities, blissful, bitter rhythms, sprung onion splitting, violins in harmony that is harmonic, chaos that is chaotic, incense that is sensible, in here it inheres, out there rapid rabbits. Let us labor under these notions as under the cantus planus factory wine. Let's stumble around, humming, stumbling, humming. Then something in the shape of leaves, something in the touching of red. Is it subversive? Let's hesitate with red. Let's feel it out with the feeling which we are. It is a panic in the full field. This outward loping, is it making it? Is it filling it? Is it making it explicit? Is this rhapsody or is this rhubarb? Let's think. In the speaking of it, it alludes. Is it a lark? It fills it and makes it explicit. It does not flatten out. Is it just spin? Like origins. Ever since the accent, I find my mouth in places unforeseen. I'm given to the understanding of others. It's not futile, but it is strange in the dark to speak the dark rolling, the gilded rowels, the stars of blood catching on the danky trussed trees. Against my nature stand all possible drones. Oranges, origins, sovereigns. For in the beginning there was a sound, and the sound was good. I licked it. It made sense. I milked it. But you see, the war unsettled it. A clean historical break right down the landing strip of it. I licked it. Something in the shape of it, something in the touching of it. The music went out of it, and my desire for it a widening gyre. Liar, you sense it? We lost our measure. I licked it. This myth. Thank you.
Yay.
Hi, Ted, again.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Aditi. I just love it. So for the folks at home, we're just going to chat a little bit about Emporium, and then I'll read a little bit, and then we'll both read a final little chunk. I read this book recently. It just came out. It's very beautiful, and I'm impressed with your ability to navigate through all of the serial poems and poems in parts and long poems in such a short amount of time. And I think you gave us a great sense of the textures in the book. And I guess I kind of wanted to start there. I was really struck in reading this with that word texture. There are a ton of different textures in the book. There's brocade, and there's silks, and there's finery. Things are being folded and dragged across faces, and it's very tactile. So there's lots of textures, but there's also actual textiles, and then the language itself sometimes moves into French and other languages. So I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about texts and textiles and textures in the book.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of easy for me to talk about because it's just something that I love. Kind of the whole dressing up and shopping game. Can people who know me tell that? I think they can. I think that's the starting point for this book, was kind of pleasure, and this movie that I was watching about these women who were, kleptomaniacs and stealing bits of silk in French department stores in turn of the century Paris, obviously because they couldn't afford it, and something about that film, and just sort of thinking about the film not just as something that you look at and that you hear, but something that's haptic, and something that sort of invites you to reach out. And I think that just sort of bled into my writing, and doing sort of somatic exercises. Somebody recommended that I wear silk all the time. I don't remember who it was exactly. And so this is the one silk shirt that I had at the time. And so I wore it every day for 7 days and got some poems out of that. So I think there are some sort of mind-body connections there. And then some of it is just sort of research and doing a lot of translation. And something that happens when I'm engaging with language that way is that there's words that suddenly just, you feel like you can't touch them anymore because you don't know what they mean. But there are also strange moments where language starts to feel like an object. So I think it was just sort of readerly experiences that I hope kind of came into the poems. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, definitely.
I'm excited.
Yeah. And then that note, there's this term edge work kept coming up for me. I felt like there was lots of moments in the book where the language becomes kind of metamorphic, and one word will move through assonance or alliteration into another word or an off rhyme, and we'll find ourselves metamorphosing in a very tactile way into another place. And the book is very it's very sensuous. I'm also wondering if you can talk a little bit about the ostensible speaker of the book. It starts out in the first person and ends there, but in the middle there's third person she's, and there's some sense of anachronism, like maybe we're a long time ago against a backdrop of an original silk route, and maybe now we're in a shopping mall, a contemporary emporium. So I wanted to hear you just think out loud a little bit about who is speaking these poems, right?
Yeah, that's a tougher one to answer, and I think partly because for the most part I never write sort of autobiographical poems that can be sort of realist in a way that this is an anecdote from my life that I'm turning into a poem. but they are nevertheless about myself. So the speaker who begins this book by saying, I came along a silk route, I mean, I think the very first audience for that line is me, sort of laughing at the idea of potentially a poet as a tradeswoman on a silk route, and of course, mapping a certain kind of real circumstance in my life where I moved to the United States about 10 years ago, just essentially to study, but have stuck around. And so I think without really realizing it, writing some of these poems may have been ways to examine that. But I think I think she and sort of placing the figures in different timescapes can just be a way to get around, or just to actually explore the field of history and a history of ideas and experience, and sort of keeping it grounded without necessarily talking about it in terms of, well, I did this or I saw this. And so the she becomes useful in that way.
Amazing. Thank you. I have a million more questions for you that I will either ask at the end or save. But I'm really grateful for the book and for your beautiful reading.
Thanks. And guys, Ted is going to read some of his poems now, and then I'll ask him questions. So let's switch things up.
Okay, thanks everybody. And thank you, Aditi, for again, for the lovely reading. I also want to thank Shane Mullen and Left Bank Books, which is, my favorite spot to go in St. Louis to support independent bookstores. Also my folks at Coffee House Press for the wonderful book that I'm going to read from tonight called Gold Cure. I'm just going to start and read 3 poems. These are drawn from 2 sections in the book titled El Dorado. The book has a number of different kinds of poems. It has a crown of sonnets about fracking. It has some poems that engage more directly with the contemporary moment politically. But these are poems about gold. And El Dorado was the sort of mythic city of gold in South America during the period of Spanish imperialism and the conquistadors. The first poem is called Melt Value. To be worth my weight in gold, at the going price of gold, I'd need to be a gnome, knee-high, dense, with mass equal to the body weight I had when I had words. I'd be a golden nude, my feet shrunken to stubs, arms brushed to soften their luster, sunlight striking my abdomen in a steady candle flame. Only my face would be polished to high gloss, a Gnostic expression lost in my eyes behind the death mask of Tutankhamun. I'd be a period piece displayed in a glass vitrine. You might come to me in the museum's final hour and ask my form to answer for a melt value that made us both. Or I could be large, life-sized, but hollow. Hammered into sheets, I'd be soldered into a man, impervious to fire, alloyed with palladium, posed midlife in mid-stride in a sculpture garden. I would throw sun back at the sun. My open palm would shine, smooth where the lifeline should be. But I'd need, in my dark interior, a nest of wire and steel to prevent my heavy trunk from slumping into itself. You might visit me there on a tour in a certain subjunctive mood, reading in the brochure a story about who I might have been and why I'm still in transit to a city I'll never reach that therefore never was. This one's called The Leprechaun Trap. The instructions for the monthly kindergarten family project are vague. For March, make a leprechaun trap. In the grainy example photo sent home in her unicorn backpack, a shoebox decked with aluminum foil is propped up by a popsicle stick over a coil of gold Mardi Gras beads. The child will pull a length of yarn tied to the stick when her prey caves to desire and wanders inside. If the assignment has pedagogical value, it is not to warn the child against vice, because a leprechaun is a leprechaun, but to compel her to spend quality time with her parents on a project that inducts her into the adult regime, where success requires manipulation of corrupted little men through acts of imagination. We settle on a mason jar filled with gelt left over from Hanukkah. To lure the leprechaun inside, she twists a stepladder from pipe cleaners. Red step, yellow, green step, blue. It rises to the rim and curls over. When the leprechaun ascends her rainbow to the summit, he will pause a moment in awe and horror, the surge of impulse saying yes, the weight of experience no. When he cannonballs into chocolate gold, he will land in a heaven that is also prison. He will laze against glass for a solitary night in the elementary school hallway, amid radiators softly clicking and three-dimensional book reports. Binging on gelt, stuffing gold foil wrappers into his satchel, he will be the bearer of his own subjection until sunrise, when the chocolate ends. Belt buckle loosened, stovepipe hat in his hands, he will pace in circles, warbled chatter flooding the jar, his walls semi-transparent, admitting light but no clarity, except for the hole above, in view, out of reach. This makes her sad, she confesses, and I agree. But he will have no regrets, because he does not make decisions, he is a condition. And to succeed, her trap must make her feel the purgative power of tragedy. Plus, I tell her as we wait for the bus, there is no such thing as leprechauns. I know, she says, I already know. And then the last one I'm going to read in this little section before we chat is the title poem, Gold Cure. It has an epigraph from Dr. Leslie Keeley, who was a doctor in the late 19th century across the river from where I'm sitting right now in St. Louis. In Illinois, in Dwight, Illinois, he opened an institute called the Keeley Institute. That was a place where people would come to get injections, intravenous injections of gold suspended in chlorine into their veins as a cure for alcoholism and other addictions. It was sometimes called the Keeley Cure or the Gold Cure. The epigraph is, I claim to destroy only the craving. Gold Cure. In the story of syringes, there are those that give, those that draw, and those whose hypodermics contain a serum that is not prophylactic, but therapeutic, a double chloride of gold, injected twice daily at the Corn Belt Sanatorium into arms of incoming inebriates and opium eaters, sots from Chicago, the jiggered and bory-eyed, habitués of hashish, arsenic, ether, and though the doctor's proprietary tonic is cut with morphine, willow bark, ammonia, and cocaine, Keeley was the first to treat booze as disease. And if I am given one wooden coin to drop into the time travel slot, I'll escort my father to one of Keeley's franchised institutes, maybe Cincinnati. We'll ride the train across the Ohio line from wherever we are or were, sunlight warming our upholstered berth. We'll use what little time we have left to laugh at the story of his granddaughter, giving the glowering phlebotomist one hell of a time, nodded on my lap in tears and hyperventilation like Lao Koan strangled by snakes, refusing to forfeit her blood to a lead test. My father will be in a suit, his breath between mouthwash and ingested vodka as he tells me the story of hitchhiking to Alaska to pan for gold but getting drafted, of mowing down a water buffalo he mistook for footsteps with his M60 after dark. I'll split my tolerance from my tolerance, thank him for his temperance during my youth. From the station, we will stroll an avenue alive with cyclists and flittering sycamore leaves, joking about how we're both in good spirits. Through the welcome gate, we will assume chaise lounges by a fountain and submit our left forearms in parallel, like an equals sign. Keeley will say, as he prepares our syringes, that if alcohol is the genius of the gambling den, it is also the emblem of blood at the Lord's Supper. If it is crime, it is also sacrament. If it is poison, it is also medicine. Our needles, then, will sink in. I'll close my eyes and embrace gold in my veins, synthesized in the collision of neutron stars thrown down in asteroids. The gold resists my earthly physiology. It passes through me like wind through a screen, leaving only a vague remainder, this dull glow, hard to locate in the body that aches for an answer just out of reach. When I open my eyes, my father will be gone, of course, his suit folded on the chaise. That is how this phase of life goes. The wind will have eased. Keeley will eye the suit, as if to say that, like the eye of a cyclone, the period of sobriety was part of the disease. Thank you.
All right, I think I'm back on screen. Congratulations, Ted, on this incredible book, which I had so much pleasure and thought reading. And it was doubly exciting because I think at first, you know, I thought, oh, okay, this is cool. I have silk and his book is gold, and that's such a cool idea. But it seemed like there's so many more connections. And if I have the silk route and silk as a way of thinking about certain, thinking about capitalism, for example, that you have gold as a way of sort of thinking through US landscapes and US histories. And there are all of these real golds and idiomatic golds, your weight in gold, for example, and ideological golds. And there's a lot of searching. The speaker of these poems is just really is going on a kind of treasure hunt, but doesn't really care about the matter of gold, but something deeper. And I guess want to, before I ask my question, read some of my favorite lines. This is from the opening poem where the speaker says, "It is dawning on me that the golden empire is gross exaggeration, that I came not for the appleness of an apple, but the appleness of this apple, now refusing to disclose to me its core." So my question is, if you could speak to this kind of passionate searching and researching, and maybe also tell us a little bit about what kinds of research you actually did, because one ends up learning quite a lot of things reading this book. And what did you do?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. I think that the best way to articulate how it came together for me is thinking about gold not as a stable metaphor for anything really, but as a kind of index of different types of desire. And the excerpt you read from the opening poem, that poem is called El Dorado, and it's set in a town in the United States named El Dorado, and there are over 40 towns named El Dorado, and there are hundreds of counties named El Dorado. And El Dorado, of course, is so interesting because there was never any there. It didn't exist. So and there's historical reasons for why people thought it did, and there were artifacts found, and so it had various locations in the European imaginary for so long. But the more that I thought about gold and studied gold, I think several things happened in terms of the search and the research. The first is that, I read, and there are a few poems that deal with that kind of historical El Dorado and historical ways in which the search for gold figured the New World. But the other kinds of poems I think were predominant, which is I just kind of became attuned to it and would start finding resonances with gold in my daily life. So the Leprechaun Trap a poem with my daughter, or I was digging in Goodwill records after I'd started this project, and I actually found an old RCA record from mid-century called Poet's Gold, which was like, and started thinking a lot about golden records and the golden record in space. So there's some ways that just having that kind of attunement to your subject matter, and obviously you know this from Silk, just kind of visits you. And then there are a few poems in the book that were actually like the project of going places. So I went to a gold mine in Cripple Creek, Colorado, which was the Independence Lode, and I'll read a poem later about that, one of the largest gold lodes in Colorado and in the country. And then an old gold dredge in Oregon and a few places named El Dorado. So there was a little bit of, as one of my friends put it, like the poet on the beat, which sounds a little silly, like I got to go to all these places and have historical importance. But so there's really like different ways in which they came together. But I was thinking just a lot about gold as having a kind of, I don't know, like an insatiable pull, and it's both a positive thing and can be really destructive.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that Eto Adnan says in one of her interviews, that the image is something with which you think. And so then if you have this image or a goal that you're obsessed with, then you just follow that and you get to have all this other stuff. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about, since you read the shorter poems, but there are these longer kind of serial poems in the book, and there's like an amazing sonnet sequence about the major shale plays in the US, and Key to the Kingdom is just like this incredible kind of State of the Union, but by Ted Mathis and not a gross president, and what feels different for you between moving from like the shorter lyric to the longer poem? What do you feel like you can do differently, or how do you think they relate to each other in the context of a book?
Yeah. I've said this before to somebody who asked me about these kinds of runs and sequences, and if there wasn't such primacy on the book as object, I think I would be naturally inclined to write like just only chapbooks. Like if that was our publishing culture, I'd be thrilled. If everything was 15 to 25 pages, I think my mind is naturally drawn to a topic that then one follows through its derivations and permutations and kind of fills itself out. And sometimes there are clusters and groups like that seem to be talking to each other. In this case, obviously oil and in this natural gas are kind of like black gold, right? Like they're also things that attract people to do absurd things to the landscape, to themselves, to uproot their lives, to risk everything, including death, to get them. So in that way, they're very clear. And then Key to the Kingdom just feels to me like a really timely serial poem that was written during literally 4 years ago in the summer of 2016, when I felt the world was breaking down, and it has this kind of nursery rhyme structure that tries to make sense of it. But we're in a much worse place now than we were even then. So
that's how it goes, I guess.
Yeah, but thank you so much for reading it so generously. I want to hear like the last pieces from you.
All right. I was gonna do my thank yous now, except my thank you piece of paper just floated away. So I'm gonna miss out some people, but I definitely want to thank Left Bank Books and Shane for putting this together, and just the sort of writing community family in St. Louis and Denver, and now burgeoning in Cincinnati. I'm so grateful to you all. Somebody I barely know replied to an email of mine saying, you can't do better than Nightboat. And I was like, yes, you're right. So holy shit, thank you so much. Nightboat Books, and Stephen Matika, Kazim Ali, Kaylin Nardone, and Lindsay Bolt for being amazing. And then there's a huge chunk of people that I would put under the category of friends, teachers, even students, even though we're not supposed to call our students anymore, and editors of journals that have supported this work, and the Laughlin jury. But I can't say all of those names without just going on forever and also kind of name dropping you amazing people. But thank you so much. I'm gonna read from, weirdly, the prologue, but not all of it. And I'm just gonna read the last few sections of it where it gets to a kind of multilingual space. For a while, it was impossible to wear silk. I'd look up at the rouged sky, I'd consider the Jesuitic races, the long lines of vox sniffing, the climate refusing to change, the clematis reminding me I was to pursue a sound, I was to steal along, I was to barter my socialisms for some mastic or gâteau slicked with rum or a velvet speculum or any sort of very erudite, unalgebraic, any sort of very telluric sort, a sort of any sort, a sottise, any sort of sottise. So I bartered my socialisms for something hierarchic, something hemorrhagic, hagiocratic, hermetical, helical, heretical, hieroglyphic, heteronymous, higher, hair, hairy. It was a hairy time. And my bush was a mulberry bush. It occasioned silk. Silk was a duration. I unpacked it, finally arriving, tender glissade, lowing in the fields, rennet skies, up ahead the emporium, up ahead, all those haptic divinities, all those sounds I came to quell, asking, questioning, comment, quel, laine, quel lin, quel coton, quel satin, quel crin, quel chanvre, quel cachemire, quel velours, quel tweed, quelle flanelle, quelle dentelle, quel calicot, quelle mousseline, quel serge, quel jute, quel jacquard, quel brocart, quel cuir, quel soie, quel que soit. Thank you.
Aditi read at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation for the 100 Boots series a while back and finished with that section, which I still find just astoundingly moving. I'm going to finish with one poem called Gold Donkey, and it's set in Cripple Creek, Colorado. The canary in the gold mine spent her nights above ground and days 1,000 feet down the same cool shaft. I descend in a metal cage to the crosscuts and drifts blasted into Independence Load and hung in her little cage low between ore cart wheels where she could die sacrificially in an updraft of monoxide. But the donkey in the gold mine was born down here, and her mother before her, a lineage accustomed to hauling rock with flecks of quartz and gold, through blackness interrupted only by a candle strapped to the mucker's hat, or a calcium carbide lamp hot with acetylene flame that leapt at the wind of a sledge, burnt off a tenderfoot's eyebrows, and singed a black star into the donkey's hide. A politician legislated light into the donkeys' lives, but the asses kicked like mad when the nippers, kids at 5 cents a shift, strung them from the cage's base in slings and sent them up the shaft into sun they'd never known. Like all good ideas, this one burnt out the retinas in seconds. While I'm below, a sunset above, I rise along a wall of oxidized iron, the color of tobacco spit, emerge. There are 12 donkeys at large in town, the bartender says, direct descendants of those from below. I search for them for an hour, but find only a coyote trotting the Family Dollar parking lot. In rain, in the donkey's honor, I choose from the strip of casinos the brass ass, wade through the usual sad cases to roulette. At the only game with no strategy, my only job is to bet on black, odd, and constellations of birthdays, then wait like an ass for the house to place the dolly and rake my chips. The dealer spins the ball against the spinning wheel and sweeps her arm to end all bets. The bottled water I ordered arrives. The brand is El Dorado. The ball falls into 29 black. I win hundreds. When a donkey bucked and contorted hard enough to slip free on a scent, it plummeted like a bullet, reversing to explode in its own chamber. Chips in stacks float to me on felt. They are not gold, but powder blue. Thank you.
Hello, I'm back. Thank you both so much for those incredible poems, the incredible readings. I know that you might not be able to hear everyone, but there are so many people clapping around the world for your poems. I know that this is a little bit different than most poetry readings and that you can't actually hear the people clapping, but they are. So thank you. And we have a large number of St. Louis's who's who of the poetry community here watching tonight. So I'm very excited to hear if they have any questions. And my question for you is, because both of you have such a, like, the sound of the poems comes through both on the page and in the reading, at what point in your writing process do you read the poem out loud?
Okay, I guess I'll go first. Is probably all the time. I told Tad, I mean, it took me a good while to read Tad's book because I read his book aloud. So you know, I read everyone's poems out loud, so I better read my own. So I do it quite a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I do it all the time as well. I usually have a draft and then I'll read the draft aloud. I've found myself reading them into the voice memo function on an iPhone and playing them back constantly to see how weird I sound. And especially with longer poems, seeing how long they take. But yeah, it's a part of the process. And I think the sonic parts of the poem are really important.
Again, we're getting a lot of applause, but I don't think I see any questions yet. So if anyone watching does have a question for either poet that they are curious about the writing process, if you're curious about the publication process, whatever that might be. But yeah, a lot of compliments. So Joseph says, great reading. Dana had a comment up here earlier, loves the beginning of El Dorado. The start of El Dorado is amazing. So, and Dana also says, love that somatic X with silk. So I think that people very much appreciate the language and the kind of beauty of the poems. So another question from me then is going to be, what advice do you, since both of you have kind of helped curate and both have taught, what advice do you have for young poets that might be kind of wanting to take their poems from just a personal thing to more of a professional thing?
Wow. I feel like every answer that I give to this, it just sounds like, I don't know, sounds really canned. And so I've been trying to be more intentional and self-reflective about this. But I've been thinking a lot about burrowing and obsession and following a line of thought, like, for a really long time. So one of the things I really encouraged my students to do recently is ask themselves what they think they know more about than anybody in the room. And it can be something really weird, like my uncle is, you know, a metalsmith and I know all about it. But then just really encourage them to not let it go until they've pursued it as far as they possibly can. And I've started to feel that, like, the history of everything is in everything if you just look hard enough. I mean, Aditi's work reveals that in this book as well.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat that piece of advice to my students. That sounds really great. I'll credit you, Ted. And actually, because I was flustered earlier and I forgot, and Dana mentioned the somatic exercise, I remembered who gave me that suggestion. It was Douglas Kearney, who was visiting at a DU where I was a student, and I was just starting to write these poems, and I told him that, I feel like poetry is so much about, like the image as a visual thing, and I want to explore touch. And he's like, oh, you should do, a C.A. Conrad somatic exercise. And it was slightly different. I adapted it, and I ended up doing that thing where I wore the silk blouse. But so maybe the advice is, one, do kind of wacky things like that, make up little exercises for yourself, but also, I guess, just, find ways to access poets, not just reading their books, but I guess we now have a lot of virtual readings, and then you could just poke in a question. And because I feel I owe a lot to Douglas Kearney for that suggestion. And and when we're back to regular programming, then actually going to the bookstores and meeting the poets and buying the books in the space. Yeah.
Hannah is asking, do you aim for specific formatting in your poetry, or just write free form as it sounds best to you? And if you do, I'm adding on, so if you do kind of start writing in a format, like, does it ever change as you're writing it?
I love form. My friends know that, and I don't necessarily write always in inherited forms, sestinas or whatever, but I love form, and I love nonce forms, so forms that you create but are replicable because you've created rules for yourself. Like a somatic exercise, I'm not going to take off this silk for a week. It's a kind of, it's a form, or your form might be really kind of only for you. I have a friend and a wonderful poet who decided to write his entire last book using only prime numbers, but you wouldn't know that just from reading the lines, but every poem has a prime number of lines, prime number of words, prime number of sections, but it was just something, it relates to the content, but I think those like self-imposed forms are the ones that I'm interested as much as 4-line stanzas or writing a sonnet, but those nonce forms I think can be really generative because they can occupy your conscious mind to allow that kind of those sort of unconscious impulses to come through where they otherwise might not.
Yeah, I'm kind of similar in that I guess I'm what you would call a free verse poet, and don't use sort of received forms, but I love prosody, and I love form. I think it's a kind of internal ordering system for dealing with chaos. And so for each kind of material, I'm usually sort of working out a few different ways to get the line right. And there are rare moments where I feel like I've arrived at the right line and the right shape for the poems. But there are some that I've rewritten, 11 times in order to try it out. And usually what happens is if I change the form, the poem itself, the ideas in the poems, what's happening changes, and it's like I'm just keep trying to get it as precise as I can get it, and so that's kind of how it plays out for me.
The one thing I would add to that is, it just occurred to me when Aditi mentioned prosody, is that it takes very little poems are often about patterning, and it takes very little for a pattern to root in the reader or listener's ear. And once it's rooted in there, then innovating within the expectations of the pattern is part of where the rhythmic surprise and emotional friction comes in poetry. We expect something, and sometimes we're gratified and sometimes we're thwarted. But having that kind of formal structure creates patterns of expectation that can make poetry really interesting.
We do have a couple more questions before we wrap up. So Rita's asking for you, Ted, how long did you work on that image of the leprechaun? Did you do something like that quickly? You see the image and go, or is it something you keep going back to over time?
So in that case, we just wanted to finish the freaking school project. So we made the Leprechaun Trap, and it went and sat in the hallway for a week. And then when it came home, the Leprechaun Trap sat on the table. And I didn't write that poem for about a month, but it was sitting there every day. And every time I would pass it, it became less and less of a school project and more of an actual place of meditation for me. Like, what if we actually captured the little asshole in the Leprechaun Trap? What would that look like? And so the poem then becomes a sort of virtual space in which you can gratify those flights of fancy. And then thinking about like what leprechauns are even. I mean, I think they're probably a racist concept in some way. I'm not even sure how to wrap my head around. But the idea of like a miniature man who's Irish, who lives at the end of a rainbow and is constantly greedy for gold, like there's a lot there. And the fact that it's a project that the school sends home to get parents to spend time with their kids. I was trying to think about like, what's the object here? What are we trying to teach our children? So anyway, it took me a month and a half, but mostly it was just because I looked at it every day.
All right. Final question from Claire. Poetry being words in space and time, how are you as poets thinking newly about time-bound practices or marking the passage of time while we're all huddled at home?
I have to say, I'm not doing much of my own writing, partly just because it's kind of hard at this time, but also because when I'm teaching, I find it hard to work on my own stuff. But what I do that's kind of a time-bound practice is that I have a lot of notebooks in which all I do is write down lines that connect to a particular theme or a word. So of course I have one for silk, and I have one for time. And then I think I'm going to start one for the pandemic, because we were reading a poem by Eduardo Corral in one of my classes, and this book is his first book, so from 2013 or so, but there was the word pandemic in it. So of course the students immediately were like, oh, this poem is about right now. And then we had to be like, no, it's actually, look at the date underneath. And it started getting me to think about the weird sort of collapses in time and the way in which we now read older poems slightly differently just because of this moment. So like every time you read the word quarantine, and it could be from 1954, you're suddenly thinking of the present moment in this very, very real way. So so maybe that's what it is. My reading practices have been affected in some way.
Yeah, that's a lovely answer. And really thoughtful. I used to keep notebooks like that and don't as much anymore, and maybe should. I think for me, the pandemic has also collapsed time and space. We're all in these physical spaces in different ways than we had been before. Before the pandemic, I used to do most of my writing out of the house. I love to write in the park, write at coffee shops, write at bars, and I was kind of like a very peripatetic poet. That's a lot of P's. During the drafting process. And this for me has been a time of really reconnecting with the space of my home and the trees in my backyard, and studying more closely the cracks in the sidewalk. And I think that maybe despite myself, it has really sharpened perceptual, acuities in ways that I otherwise would have been too busy to notice. And I think that like sharpening up your perceptions is something that's really useful in the long run, even if right now it just means I'm being really slow around the house. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Sorry, I was typing to tell people where they could get copies of the book, which is what I'm about to talk about. So both copies of the books, both books are available at left-bank.com. It really does help support this virtual event series. I want to thank both of you tonight for being so generous with your time, with your reading, with sharing these beautiful poems. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Shane.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in.
Thanks.
Absolutely, from all over the world.
Hey.
All right, have a good night, and we will see you again soon.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.